Can you remember what you bought last week? This is a question I love asking people. Like, tell me what you spent last Tuesday. Most people cannot tell you. And that's because a lot of our spending decisions are completely done almost on autopilot without us fully thinking about it. 30 years ago, every purchase required effort. You had to get in your car, drive somewhere, physically hand over the money. Each step was a checkpoint where your brain could kind of ask yourself, do I actually need this? Today, that entire process takes 15 seconds and requires basically zero physical effort. And sure, people argue, yeah, it's more convenient. Like, it's better now. We're saving more time. But I would argue that it's actually just making us overspend and buy things we don't need. And it's also rewiring how we make financial decisions in ways that most people don't realize. I'm Hannah, and this is Your Brain on Money. Today, I want to talk about how convenience culture is quietly draining our bank accounts, isolating us from each other, and turning consumption into identity. We are living in the most convenient era in human history, and yet we're more financially stressed, more socially isolated, and more anxious than ever before. Over the past few weeks in my newsletter, I've been diving into convenience culture, how we got here, what it's costing us, and why it's so hard to see what's happening. So if you're interested in reading those deep dives, you can check out the link in my bio. But what I've found is that this isn't about laziness or lack of willpower for individual people. It's really about a system that has systemically removed every obstacle between wanting something and having it. And in the process, we have lost something fundamental about how humans are supposed to make these types of decisions. And I would argue that convenience culture has actually made a lot of aspects of our society worse, including how we interact with each other. And I want to talk about how this shows up in three ways that are all connected. So the first is financially. Financially, we're spending more than ever on things that probably don't improve our lives. The average American pays a convenience tax of about 300 to 500 per month on things like delivery fees, speedy shipping, subscription services, convenience store markups. That adds up to $3,600 to $6,000 a year, just for the privilege of not having to wait or plan ahead. Socially, we are more isolated than any previous generation. We have designed human interaction out of our daily lives. If you think about self-checkout, automated everything, ordering online versus going to stores. And because of that, we've lost these casual encounters that used to teach us how to be in community with other people. And the third thing is psychological, in that we've turned consumption into identity. We're not buying things anymore, we're buying who we are, or rather, who we think we should be. And then when that identity is built on purchasing decisions rather than genuine self-knowledge, it becomes unstable. You're always one aesthetic shift away from needing to construct yourself. And the really uncomfortable part about all this is that it did not happen by accident. So I'm a certified financial planner and I talk about money psychology, and I think a lot about how these factors have affected my own money and how I think about my own spending patterns. And a great example was during the pandemic, I got really into skincare. I was living alone, I was working from home, and I just became engrossed in like reading about skincare, watching, content about skincare, buying all these different types of skincare. And what I realized, months later is that it wasn't really about the skincare. It was feeling like I belonged to something, that I belonged to a certain aesthetic, and that I wanted other people to perceive me a certain way, as someone that had their life together, and so much of the community around these aesthetics is largely parasocial. And I was spending this money to reinforce this idea that I wanted people to view me as, instead of aligning it with how I actually was or how my values were, right? And once I saw this pattern in myself, I really started to see it everywhere in how people spent their money. I mean, so much of our spending is simply because we want other people to view us a certain way. A lot of it is just signaling and how we want other people to perceive us. We're all trying to purchase our way into being the people we think we should be. And the system is designed to make this as easy and invisible as possible. So let's talk about friction. And I don't mean the annoying kind. I actually mean the kind that's good, that can actually prevent us from overspending. So for most of human history, getting what you wanted required effort. And that's not a bug in the system. That is a feature. Every obstacle in the purchasing process, for example, was a checkpoint where your brain engaged in deliberate processing. And that's the mental muscle that weighs costs, considers alternatives, and makes more intentional choices. It just forces you to slow down and think in that way. For example, before online shopping was a thing, you would have to drive to the store. That meant you had to think about if you really wanted to drive to the store and buy that thing. Back before there was tap to pay or even credit cards, you had to physically hand over cash. That activates what people call the pain of paying. And that's a real thing. fMRI scans show that spending money activates the same part of your brain that also processes physical pain. It's like an evolutionary warning system. But that pain signal is proportional to how concrete the payment feels. So handing over cash often hurts the most. You feel like you're parting with something tangible. That cash feels pretty tangible. Swiping a card hurts less. Like you're separating yourself more from the actual money leaving your bank account. tapping your phone hurts even less. And if you take something like today, like clicking one button, buy now on your computer that already has your saved payment information, your brain barely registers it as, you're separating yourself from your money. You're actually spending money. And so again, there was so much friction that existed in the payment process, and we've obliterated all of it, and we've kind of called it progress and like, look how convenient everything is now. But at what cost, right? At what cost? And tech companies didn't stumble into making spending frictionless. They deliberately, systematically removed every obstacle between wanting something and buying it. If you think about things like one click to buy or the targeted social media ads that you see, so much of that is companies spending millions of dollars using behavioral insights to drive you to spend money. They're condensing the kind of whole purchase pattern or the whole purchase journey from like, ooh, maybe I want this thing to actually buying it. They want to condense it as quickly as possible because then you're more likely to buy, right? Like every additional click, every additional form field, every moment where you have to kind of think if you actually want this thing, that is opportunities for you to change your mind. And companies don't want you to do that. Buy now, pay later is probably the most psychologically sophisticated version of this. It already takes this like already diminished pain of digital payment and fractures it even more into these small pieces. So your brain registers the entire purchase as even less, even when the total amount is still the same. For example, like 4 payments of $25 feels dramatically different than $100, even if it's obviously the same amount of money total. And all of this is working. We're seeing studies about young borrowers carrying more buy now, pay later debt as a percentage of their total debt than any other age group. Like these services are becoming more and more popular. They're being mass marketed. There's advertisements everywhere. They're on almost every type of online checkout. It's ubiquitous. And I think, again, because you're being constantly inundated with these options and it's as frictionless as possible, you're like, oh, well, why wouldn't I just do this easier option? Because your brain doesn't want to like use the willpower to kind of think through all these things. Again, it's like operating on autopilot. And a lot of these products take advantage of that. And then on top of this, we get social media. Social media didn't just make it easier to buy things, it turned consumption into content. I mean, think about Instagram in 2015. It was completely different than what we see today. I mean, at the end of the day, most of these social media apps are shopping apps. TikTok, Instagram, they're shopping apps. They're really not town square sharing content, though that's part of it. Really about, it's a store. It's about getting you to purchase things. I mean, even like the rise of these apps having their own shopping platforms within them, it's all embedded. And if you think about kind of how the fees have changed over the past few years, a lot of it is not just like entertainment. You often get like sponsored ads when you're scrolling. You're swimming in this like continuous stream of purchasable content. And on top of this, the line between content and advertisement has been erased. Like it's often very hard to tell if something is an ad or not. And then on top of this, over the past 10 years, there's this rise of like lifestyle influencers, right? Which is, I always find a very kind of ironic sort of job because essentially what you're doing is selling an aspirational lifestyle and trying to get people to buy products to fit that aspiration that you're trying to sell. I mean, your entire job is pushing products on people so they can be more like how you're presenting yourself online, right? Like the entire job description is to make you believe that buying the right things will make you feel the way that you appear to feel. And it works because it doesn't feel like advertising. It feels like a friend, and this is where parasocial relationships come in, is showing you something cool. Except your friend doesn't have a team optimizing their content. Your friend isn't paid thousands of dollars by brands to subtly position themselves or position these products as essential to a certain type of lifestyle. 3 in 4 consumers have said that they've bought a product because an influencer recommended it. And again, it's a great example of how we're living in an environment that has been specifically engineered to extract money based on our psychological vulnerabilities. So yes, the most obvious cost is financial, but even that is hidden through what behavioral economists call mental accounting. So for example, a $200 purchase, that feels significant. That often requires some sort of justification to make that purchase. But $8 25 times doesn't trigger that same mental alarm, even though it's literally the same amount of money. And then, like I was saying earlier, you get into like a convenience tax where you often kind of pay these little fees that really add up over time for kind of that idea of convenience. Like if you think about food delivery apps or even like convenience stores charge premiums often over like wholesale stores. All of that is just these little fees and they tack it on and they're very small. And so it doesn't feel like a ton, but of course it adds up. Add it up and you're looking at kind of potentially hundreds of dollars a month in this convenience tax. And for many people, that could be the difference between like building savings and living paycheck to paycheck. But because it's distributed across dozens of small transactions, it feels more invisible. And something that's really important to point out here is that our culture has made it so that we are relying on convenience. Many people feel like they cannot get ahead no matter how hard they work. They're exhausted, they're stressed out, they have cognitive fatigue. They don't want to make a lot of decisions. They don't want to get up and like go to the grocery store and figure out what they want to cook and then come back and cook it, right? We have created a society that has just made people exhausted and stressed. So because of that, here comes convenience culture selling you the solution. Oh, you don't have to worry about kind of making all these decisions. You can just click one button and food will be delivered for you. And, again, convenience culture kind of is marketing the solution to a problem that it created, if that makes sense. And this is more likely to affect lower income consumers because one, it's a greater proportion of their income that's being spent on this kind of stuff. And two, oftentimes they're working, either multiple jobs or they're working certain hours, certain shifts where they have to rely on convenience, right? It's harder to plan ahead. So you have to use, delivery apps or convenience services and pay that upcharge. Maybe you're facing certain financial fees because, your income is irregular. And, research has shown that people in lower income neighborhoods pay higher convenience markups. They have fewer options for bulk buying, which is typically cheaper. And they have more time pressure to solve those immediate problems with immediate purchases. I've always said that being poor is extremely expensive, and convenience and the convenience tax is a pretty big part of that. So the other thing that I think doesn't get talked about enough is how convenience and consumption culture is changing how we treat each other. Because I think it's directly contributing to a low trust, less empathetic society. So first off, we're in a loneliness epidemic. People feel disconnected from other people. They don't feel like they're part of a community. And on top of this, we've eliminated human interaction from a lot of our transactions. So in that, we've lost a lot of these weak ties that you have in your community. If you think about your barista, the cashier at the grocery store, I live in New York, so the bodega worker, right? When you eliminate these human interactions, you lose the casual practice of treating others as people rather than obstacles. And you form those weak ties that help make up a community. And you have to navigate the sometimes awkward and messiness of human interaction. Like if you do self-checkout, that means you don't have to interact with a cashier. Using a delivery app means you don't have to, interact with people that work at a grocery store or even in a restaurant. Automation and just ordering everything online means you can go days without meaningful human interaction. And when you do have to interact with service workers, and what this leads to is that we as a society have become crueler and less empathetic, right? Like the more accustomed we have become to instant gratification, because that's what happens in convenience culture, the less we are able to regulate our emotional responses when things do not happen on a instant timeline. And I'm sure at some point you've seen a viral video about a customer attacking a service worker. And these are not outliers. They are symptoms of something larger, a mass erosion of empathy that convenience culture has accelerated and normalized. I've worked as both a barista and a waitress. And something that I was so struck by is how mean customers could be to service workers and how dehumanizing the work could feel at times. Because I think a lot of times customers see a service worker as an obstacle to them getting what they want. And when they do not get what they want, when they want it, they often lash out at the service workers. And this becomes even worse when you're not even face to face. So if you think about like a customer service worker who's on the phone, you're not sitting and actually seeing the person. Again, it doesn't feel like you're actually communicating with the person. And I think that gives a greater license for people to be very, very cruel. And I think this happens because the system has trained us, again, to see people as obstacles to our convenience rather than humans deserving respect. And the last cost to this, as I was saying before, is psychological. Convenience culture has convinced us that the way to build identity, to belong, to have worth is through purchasing decisions. Think about kind of some of these viral aesthetic trends like clean girl aesthetic, college core, dark academia, etc. Again, these aren't descriptions of personality or values. They're descriptions of purchasing patterns. And of course, the trap in this is that identity built through consumption is inherently unstable. It requires constant maintenance through continued purchasing. You can never buy enough to feel securely established in that identity. People who derive their self-worth from material possessions will likely have lower life satisfaction, more anxiety worth relationships. And I always say that money is a tool to help you live the life you want to live. And so you need to understand yourself and your values in order for money to do its job. And when you don't know what your actual values are, when your entire identity is constructed through consumption rather than genuine self-knowledge, You can't use your money to build a life that actually satisfies you. The gap between the identity you're trying to purchase and the one you actually inhibit just keeps widening. And so then you keep spending to close that gap, never realizing that purchasing might not get you there. So as you can see, so much of this is problematic. And so the question is like, okay, why don't we just stop? Why is it so hard? So again, this is all obviously problematic. And so the question is, okay, why can't we just stop? And I hinted at this before, but the thing is that for many people, convenience is not a luxury, it is survival, especially in today's day and age and today's economy. When you are working two jobs to make rent, you don't have time to cook for scratch or run multiple errands. You often need the fastest option. You need services that save time because you don't have time. And there's this whole other how this is wrapped up in capitalism and this feeling like you have to be productive at all times and the idea of like everything has to be optimized. So there's a cultural component to this as well. And I think a lot of people feel like they need convenience because they're exhausted from a system that demands constant productivity. But that convenience often isolates us further, which makes us more dependent on the system, which exhausts us more. It's like this cycle that really does serve capitalism perfectly. And isolated consumers spend more. This has been backed by research. They typically won't organize collectively because they feel isolated. They often won't demand systemic change because they're managing their own overwhelm. And a lot of times, financial anxiety, it leads to shame. And that's a very like isolating thing where you feel like, you're the only one dealing with it. And you often blame yourself instead of kind of looking out and thinking systemically, right? When people are disconnected from community, they are easier to exploit. Then, of course, there's the algorithmic amplification of all of this. When you're looking online, when you're shopping online, you're giving companies your data and making it easier for them to market products to you. If you're shopping on social media, what you're buying, all of that is being shared and they're able to target you. And again, these companies are spending millions and millions of dollars to target you. And social media algorithms also, they surface up content typically that is more consumption based, more aesthetic, more shopping. They want you to spend more money, right? They're optimizing for your purchases. They're not necessarily thinking about your bank account or your well-being. And that's why I always like to challenge people when they say like, "Oh, I have a spending problem." Like, yes, there's an individual component here, but it's also really important to point out that you are living in a digital environment that is optimized to extract money from your loneliness, your insecurity, and your desire to belong. And finally, I think it's important to point out how we've culturally reframed all of this in a way that makes it feel invisible. So if you think about like shopping as self care, you're investing in yourself, you're treating yourself, all of that is marketing language. All of these reframes are genius from a marketing perspective. They're taking an activity that could produce guilt and turn it into something that feels virtuous. And again, it makes it about you just need to have self control. It's an individual failing if you are susceptible to these things. But again, you are successfully doing when you buy something what a multi-billion-dollar industry has designed for you to do, particularly when you're in a psychologically vulnerable state. Okay, so what do we actually do about this? Because I'm not going to tell you to delete all your shopping apps and never order delivery again. That's not realistic, and that's also not the point. The point is to rebuild some of this deliberate processing that convenience culture has stripped away. And I want to talk about like what that might look like. So the first thing is just awareness. For 1 week, just 1 week, track every non-essential expense, not to judge yourself, but just to bring things to the surface. And you're not just going to track what you spend, track your emotions around it, how you felt before and after you bought the thing. Like, what emotion are you feeling? Were you scrolling social media? Like, what were you doing when you decided to buy? How did you feel after? And you're really looking for patterns. And, maybe you're shopping when you're bored or anxious or lonely or after seeing a certain type of content. And once you start to see these patterns, you can interrupt it. Not by like forcing yourself not to buy something, but by recognizing like, I'm not actually wanting this thing. I'm feeling isolated and my brain is suggesting shopping as a solution. And like this recognition and awareness alone can actually give you the space to choose a different response. The second thing is to add friction. Because shopping has kind of made things more frictionless, the solution is actually to add some of that intentional friction back in. So, like maybe you could delete some of your shopping apps from your phone or unsubscribe from promotional emails or remove your credit card information from the computer. You want to make it so that when you want to buy something, you have to actively choose to do it rather than being swept along by this frictionless path that the platforms have created. Even the 5 seconds it takes to get up and walk to get your credit card to purchase something, that pause gives your brain time to engage in the decision-making parts rather than just the emotional response parts. The third strategy, which is arguably one of the hardest ones, but probably the most important, is to rebuild that connection infrastructure. That means like showing up, investing in your community, investing in social time, you know, putting yourself out there, choosing the option that involves human interaction rather than automation. And I know this feels very hard when we're already lonely and stressed, but this cycle that we're in doesn't break on its own. Shopping will never make you feel connected enough to stop actually needing to shop. The only thing that breaks that cycle is actual connection. And that's why it's so important. And there's data to back this up, right? Like people with strong social connections report both higher life satisfaction and lower kind of frivolous discretionary spending. Not because they're depriving themselves, but because they're meeting their actual needs through connection rather than trying to purchase their way there. And the fourth thing is to kind of like question the identity that you're trying to buy when you're spending. And again, so much of our spending is emotional and tied to how we want others to perceive us. And again, it's on an autopilot. So a lot of times we don't even realize what we're buying. But like taking time to actually like think about what you're trying to purchase, like, oh, am I buying this thing or am I buying an idea of myself? If you can't imagine yourself using this product when no one's watching, when you're not documenting it, why do you want it? What are you trying to signal with this purchase? And I think it's worth examining that. And I think it'll help you kind of unpack the needs or the emotional needs you're trying to meet with this purchase. Like maybe it's belonging or status or control, and then you can start to think like, oh, are there some non-consumer ways to meet those needs that actually might work better? Something I always tell people to ask themselves is if I had to describe my values without referencing any brands or products, what would I say? And this actually is a lot harder than it sounds because I think a lot of people's self concept is built around consumption choices. And so removing that kind of helps you understand what is underneath. And basically, the goal of all of this is to become conscious of when you're buying things versus buying identity, and then recognizing that the identity you're trying to purchase is an illusion anyway. Now, I want to be really clear about something before I end. Individual changes matter, but they're not enough. The system that created these problems won't be solved by our own personal optimization. That requires holding both individual responsibility and systemic critique at the same time. So, like, yes, you can choose to be more intentional with your spending, but we also need to regulate how companies are manipulating spending behavior. And yes, you can choose to add friction to your own purchasing process, but we also need to question an economy that depends on conspicuous consumption to function, right? Both these things are necessary. The work is both internal and external. So it's important and a good idea to examine your relationship with consumption and convenience. It's also showing up for movements that challenge the systems that created those problems in the first place. And you will fail. You will fail at this constantly. That is expected. You will order DoorDash when you're exhausted. You'll buy things you don't need. You'll choose convenience when you're overwhelmed. And the point is not perfection. It is not perfection. It is awareness and then having that course correction. And I really strongly believe that self-compassion is one of the most important things you can have when it comes to your money. And it's a prerequisite also for having empathy towards other people, right? If you are constantly berating yourself for your money, you might not have the capacity to extend that grace to anyone else. The system that we are currently in is designed to exhaust us, isolate us, and keep us spending. We are all caught in it together. And the answer is not individual salvation through better consumer choices. It is reaching towards each other despite that and within the system, and then building those relationships and communities that make different ways of living possible. And if this video made you see your spending habits differently or made you uncomfortable about convenience culture, that's the point. We cannot make better decisions while lying to ourselves about the decisions we're currently making. If you found this video interesting, please like and subscribe. I'm Hannah. This is Your Brain on Money, and I'll see you next time.